The first part of the Peloponnesian War is the so-called Archidamian War, named after the Spartan king Archidamus. And what we're going to do is we're going to recap over the strategies used by Athens and Sparta in the Archidamian War and some of the key events, down to the Peace of Nicias. Spartan strategy for the war essentially was focused on provoking the Athenians into a decisive land battle. The Spartans had the best land army. They thought the war would be quick. They were aiming at the defeat of Athens, and really what they decided to do was to embark on, at the behest of Archidamus, the Spartan king, an annual invasion of Attica, the region around Athens, burning crops and surrounding towns, trying to provoke the Athenians into a battle, into a land battle where they knew they would beat the Athenians. The Athenians' strategy for the war was different to the Spartans because it was really all about trying to exhaust Sparta. They weren't really aiming for the total defeat of the Spartans, unlike the other side. The Athenians were well aware that they had the best navy, the most resources, and Pericles certainly knew that the war would last a long time. The whole idea was to exhaust Sparta, and Pericles would use the island fortress strategy, using the long walls that linked the port of the Piraeus to the city of Athens in order to keep the city supplied, even at times when the Peloponnesian forces were destroying large parts of Attica. The Athenian navy could import all supplies, and Athenian refugees from the areas around Athens could flood into Athens at times where the Spartans and the Peloponnesians were launching their attacks during the summer. Certainly these are Athens' fortifications that expand along the lines of those put out by Themistocles. Themistocles was obviously instrumental in the rebuilding of Athens after the Persian Wars. These walls had over time been linked, so the walls around the city of Athens had been linked to the Piraeus, creating something called the island fortress strategy. Now, while this would work in the short term, in terms of ensuring that the population was supplied, it did make Athens incredibly vulnerable to any type of illnesses or any type of plague that would erupt in areas where Athens was gaining its supplies from. Basically, the Athenians had quarantined themselves. So following the second invasion of Attica, the Athenians were hit by this plague, and the people blamed Pericles for taking him to war and held him responsible for their problems. They wished to send ambassadors to Sparta to sue for peace, and Pericles was summoned to give some type of justification over the strategy that he'd chosen. Now, the Pnyx is a good site for many Athenian speeches. The funeral speech was delivered at a place called Keramikos, so it's slightly different to the Pnyx location. But in short, what does Pericles say in one of his speeches to the Athenians once the war had started? Well, basically, he was aware that he was a scapegoat, and that he had persuaded the Athenians to go to war. And absolutely, Pericles was well aware that the demos, the people were blaming, trying to blame someone. And Pericles basically said it wasn't his fault because, first of all, the plague was unpredictable, so he couldn't expect this to happen. Athens is not a dictatorship, it's a democracy. They'd all voted for war. And really, the first sign of misfortune results in anger. If you're going to criticize him for things as unpredictable as a plague, then surely you need to praise him for all of the positives that will happen. Pericles basically is a bit of a telling off, but also a pep talk. And certainly he was telling the Athenians to be aware of the greatness of their empire. The idea their navy could sail anywhere in the world. They deserve it because of the Persian Wars and their actions in it. They control the seas. They're naturally superior to their opponents. The intelligence and courage that they repeatedly demonstrate. And crucially, he tells the Athenians that they've got to hold their resolve and that they shouldn't give up the Athenian empire. He says that your empire is like a tyranny, and that even though it's the greatest power that has existed in history, basically everyone envies them. that the Athenians have incurred hatred because of the way they've administered their allies, but also because everyone is envious of them. And Pericles basically says to face calamity is real strength. Now that leads us on to a really interesting section in Thucydides in Book 2, verse 65, when he outlines what Pericles said to the Athenians, says that he was fined, but then gets his sort of influence back. But then Thucydides goes on to mention what happens after Pericles' death, where the Athenians do the contrary to what he had told them to do. Pericles had warned them against expanding their empire. And crucially, the Athenians, rather than listening to Pericles and showing resolve and not expanding their empire and not going out on the attack, they do just that. And Thucydides is really critical of demagogues that whip up the people and the people themselves for voting for these endeavours. The plague really affected Athens massively, in terms of roughly a quarter to a third of all Athenians died. Pericles himself died in 429 BC, and that massively weakened the Athenian military and navy. It also shows the weakness of the island fortress idea. Now, there's a fascinating piece of archaeological evidence that links to the plague and the impacts of the plague, and also Athens' need for cash, called the Theudipos decree, which is really, really, really fabulous. It's contemporary, it's archaeological, it's really reliable and useful to us. And the Theudipos decree is all about a tribute reassessment by the Athenians in 425. The decree language is spectacularly harsh, and it massively increases the amount of tribute that's demanded from the allies because of the war. So the Theudipos decree is great evidence for continued harsh Athenian treatment of our allies. That's similarly corroborated by Plutarch. So Plutarch, the great biographer, when he writes about the much earlier Athenian Aristides, who's seen as a fair Athenian when the Delian League is set up, he contrasted Aristides' fairness with the attitude of later Athenians. So Plutarch, when he's mentioning Aristides, remember Plutarch writing in the 1st century AD, so he had a full view about what had happened to Athens. He said that after Pericles' death, the demagogues increased the tribute little by little until they brought the total to 1,300 talents. Now, that's slightly different to the 1,500 in the Theudipos, but it's still a lot of money. They did this not so much because of the lengths and the fortunes of war, but because they enticed the people into distributions of money, payments for public shows, and constructing cult statues. So some interesting views from Plutarch as to why the Athenians increased the tribute. Theudipos decree as well is all talking about a substantial increase in tribute as a result of the plague. So Athens goes on the attack after the Athenian plague, and we can look very briefly at the Athenian victory at Pylos, which is a daring raid led by Cleon and another chap called Demosthenes, where the Athenians capture 292 Spartiates, so full male Spartan soldiers, and the important port of Pylos. This is part of a strategy called epitaikismos, which is roughly the strategy of building a fort in enemy territory. The Athenians will later do, so the Spartans rather will later do that by occupying the fort of Decelea. So what happens at Pylos? Well, Thucydides gives us a really great description of what happens at this location, where the Athenian general Demosthenes set up forts hoping to encourage Helot revolts. The Spartans, so we've got an Athenian fort here, the Spartans decided to take up position on the island of Sphacteria to block Athenian supplies. However, Spartans, not maybe quite thinking out their strategy, will be rather shocked when an Athenian fleet arrived at trapping the Spartans on the island, the small island of Sphacteria. The Spartans ended up being captured. So crucially, there's some action on here. The Spartans end up burning down their own cover, and 292 Spartans, rather than fighting to the death, are actually captured and transported to Athens. The Spartans sent an embassy to Athens to ask for terms at this point. So interesting that the capture of just 292 soldiers led to Sparta actually offering peace, which is a good indication of how small the Spartiate population is. However, crucially, the Athenian demagogue Cleon persuaded the Athenians to reject the peace deal, and as I said, the island is the 292 Spartans surrender to the shock of everybody. There's a fantastic artifact in the Agora Museum in Athens, which is one of the captured Spartan shields taken by the Athenians here. And it's absolutely completely been battered. It's really been put through the mill, and on it has been scratched. The Athenians taking this from the Lacedaemonians on Pylos. So it's a really fantastic bit of evidence that corroborates really beautifully with the Thucydides coverage. Interestingly, at the same time as the forces are engaged in Pylos, we are told of Athenian attempts to gain some Persian support with the supposed Peace of Epicelius, which is an embassy sent to Persia in 424. So this is quite interesting. And then also in Aristophanes' Arcanians, obviously earlier, but this does recall about an Athenian embassy being sent to Persia in 427 and having just returned. So interestingly, if we ever get an essay question that's looking at Persian interference in Greek affairs, this is some potential Persian interference in the first stage of the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans have their peace rejected after Pylos, and as a result go out on the attack. And this is led by a Spartan called Brasidas, who takes a team of 700 or so freed helots north to try and provoke rebellions and revolts amongst Athens' northern allies in order to cut off her access to tribute and grain. So essentially, this assault by Brasidas was in order to provoke these revolts. And because of the loss of those Spartan hostages, Brasidas went north with merely a force of freed helot slaves. Brasidas is viewed spectacularly positively by Thucydides. Now, that might be because, of course, Thucydides lost Amphipolis to Brasidas, so he's trying to maybe portray Brasidas as a more effective general than what he was. But even so, Brasidas still attracts a lot of support away from the Athenians. So Brasidas takes his 700 helots to start revolts amongst Athens' northern allies, and importantly, the crucial city of Amphipolis swapped to Brasidas' side. Thucydides, who was supposed to be controlling Athens' territory in the north, rushed to Amphipolis, but by the time he gets there, Amphipolis had already swapped to Brasidas, and as a result, Thucydides was exiled from Athens as a result of that, and therefore spends the rest of his time in exile, which is really bad for Thucydides, but fabulous for us, because at this point he starts writing his history, and because of his exile, it means he's able to get a Peloponnesian perspective on events. Cleon, meanwhile, took an Athenian force to attack Brasidas' forces. And there's a couple of notable events. First of all, the massacre at Scione. Basically, there was a range of cities that had swapped to the Spartan side, but Brasidas, because of his limited number of troops, couldn't defend everywhere. Scione is wiped out by Cleon and his forces. And then we've got the Battle of Amphipolis itself, where both Cleon and Brasidas are killed. The two key warmongers of both city-states are wiped out, or killed rather, and that gives us an opportunity for a peace treaty. Brasidas' campaigns are portrayed by Thucydides in a few notable verses and notable sections in Book 4. And the idea is that Brasidas was a very effective speaker for a Spartan. He was lenient and showed mercy to inhabitants from the towns that were either Athenian citizens or not. So Brasidas is seen as a very effective general, a very effective leader, and as a massive contrast to Cleon, who is viewed as incompetent and a coward. Cleon killed notably while running away from the Battle of Amphipolis, whereas Brasidas only dies when he finds out that the Spartans Spartans and their allies rather, have actually won. But is Thucydides possibly doing this as a contrast to make himself and his own loss of Amphipolis seem a little bit better? With the death of Brasidas and Cleon, we get something called the Peace of Nicias, or Nicias, however you want to say it. And this peace treaty is supposedly set up, which would envisage a large period of peace between Athens and the Peloponnese. However, we're told by Thucydides that Corinth especially was seething about this, and would absolutely try and break down this peace treaty. And what Corinth in particular will do is it will try and persuade the city of Argos to ally with Athens, knowing that that would mean that this peace treaty would be ripped up. So the Corinthians in particular are not happy about the peace treaty. It's not a real peace. Thucydides says in this section, it's not a real peace because neither side gives back what's agreed. There's still fighting and truces that are renewed on a regular basis in Greece itself. But crucially, this is where Thucydides says about his exile puts him in a good position to record events, and it gives him an eyewitness view and an accurate view of events. Athens also had large numbers of supporters that were against a peace treaty, noticeably led by Alcibiades. And Alcibiades, a young man in a hurry, certainly didn't want Athens to make peace with the Peloponnesians at this point. He was peeved off with the Spartans that they'd not approached for a peace treaty through him because of his family connections with the Spartans and with the Peloponnese. It's mainly going to be Alcibiades that's going to persuade the Athenians to ally with Argos, and Alcibiades is going to be a particularly colourful character for the rest of the module. So why was this peace treaty a complete failure? Well, first of all, Sparta's allies don't accept the treaty, like Corinth. Amphipolis not returned to Athens. Pylos not returned to Sparta. Athens allied with Argos, as Corinth wanted, and Corinth certainly encouraged city-states to break the peace treaty. And this all resulted in a huge battle in 418 BC, where Sparta held a battle against Athens, Elis, Argos, and Mantinea, which pretty much ends the Peace of Nicias. And this is the end, I suppose, of the Archidamian War and the first stage of the Peloponnesian War. It's pretty much a score draw at this point.